Well, hi everyone, and welcome to week number 2 of the course. This week, what I'd like to do is just provide you a brief or somewhat brief video overview of the topic for week 2, which is the budgeting process. Go through the federal, state, and local budgeting processes and just kind of give you a working understanding of how we put budgets together at all 3 different levels of our intergovernmental system. Now, last week, we focused primarily on definition of budgeting. We talked about some of the foundational aspects of public finance, such as public versus private goods, market failures, externalities, privatization, and some of the reasons why we have government intervention into different aspects of the economy. The more government intervention that you have, obviously, the larger your budgets will become. But how do we put those budgets together? How do we come up with a budget document that we will be analyzing here in this class throughout the term? Well, the budget process can be a very complicated process, and you will see as we spend the next few minutes talking about the federal level, you'll see just how many nuances and how many details there are in the federal budget process. But overall, in any budget process, there are 4 basic cycles to the process. The first cycle or phase of the process is what we call preparation. Before we can know how much money we have to spend and what we're spending that money on, we have to have a good sense of how much we are generating in revenue. So in preparation, we will do revenue forecasts, we will do expenditure estimates, and basically in preparation, what we are doing is we are doing all the groundwork that we need to do in order to construct the executive level budget. So in the preparation phase, for instance, at the federal level, this is going to occur before the president puts his or her budget together and then transmits that budget to Congress. So this is all the preparation type of work with revenue forecasts and expenditure estimates. And that's your first phase of the budget process, preparation. The second phase is formulation. Formulation occurs after the chief executive, whether it be the president or a governor, prepares their executive budget. So when they prepare their executive budget and they have their executive budget ready to go, it then gets transmitted to the legislature, whether it be Congress or a state legislative body. Once that executive budget goes to the legislature, you then transition from the preparation phase into the formulation phase of budgeting. So when you talk about the formulation phase of budgeting, you are talking about legislative work. This is where the legislature gets to work on analyzing and changing and modifying that executive budget. So your second phase, formulation, typically most of that occurs within the legislature. Once the legislature has approved the budget, or as in the case of the federal level, the different appropriation bills, and that budget or those appropriation bills have then been signed by the chief executive, once the new fiscal year begins, you then transition into your third phase, which is implementation and execution. In implementation and execution, this is where you are actually spending the money. So at the federal level, the implementation execution phase will begin on October 1st, because that's the day that the federal fiscal year begins. Here in California, for the vast majority of agencies in California, July 1st is where the fiscal year begins, and that will be the first day then of your implementation execution phase. But in that third phase of implementation, you are actually executing the budget, you're actually spending the appropriations. Then when the fiscal year ends, at the federal level, it ends on September 30th, the state level, it ends on June 30th. At the end of the fiscal year, you then transition into your fourth phase, which is audit and evaluation. Audit and evaluation, we are going to go back and we are going to analyze how we spent the money to make sure we spent our money in our legally appropriated methods, and also to do kind of a performance audit to make sure that not only are we spending the money in the legally appropriate manner, but we're also spending the money in an effective and efficient manner as well. So audit and evaluation, your fourth and final phase of the budget process, will occur once the fiscal year has closed. So once the fiscal year is over, that's when you move into audit and evaluation. So those 4 phases or cycles of the budget process are typical regardless of whether you're talking about federal budgeting, state budgeting, or local budgeting. You're going to have basically those 4 different phases. The difference, though, will be in terms of what happens in each of those phases. And those phases look a lot different depending upon whether you're at the federal, state, or the local level. So our touch point, if you will, for our entire discussion of budgeting processes will be the federal budget process. And we do that, again, because state and local budgeting processes tend to piggyback off of the way in which the federal government does it. So let's spend a few minutes talking about the federal budget process in very broad strokes, because again, there are a lot of details, a lot of nuance to the federal budgeting process that are well beyond the scope of this class to get into. What I just want to do is introduce you to how those 4 different phases work at the federal level, and then we'll use that discussion as a guide for understanding how that process then works at the state and the local level. So let's start with your first phase. So we said the first phase of the budgeting process is preparation. So at the federal level, preparation is going to occur long before the creation of the executive budget. So if you've got an executive budget, a presidential budget that's going to be completed and ready to go by the end of January, your preparation phase is going to start probably a year or a year and a half before that. In preparation, what you are doing is, again, you are forecasting revenues and you're estimating expenditures. The 2 primary stakeholders who are involved in the preparation phase for the federal budget will be the Office of Management and Budget and the Congressional Budget Office, OMB and CBO. OMB is a part of the executive branch. It serves at the pleasure of the president, and its job is to manage all budgetary issues for the president. So what will happen in preparation is the Office of Management and Budget will put together what it calls its current service estimates. And the current service estimates will form the primary document that OMB creates in the preparation phase. So what's in current service estimates? In its current service estimates, what OMB will do is it will ask the very simple question: if we were to continue providing the same level and the same types of services next year that we provided this year, how much more money would that cost us? Now, you're probably thinking, well, if it's the same level of services, why is it going to cost more next year? Well, because of the change in the value of money, increase in inflationary costs, all those different types of things are going to increase the cost of doing the same thing next year that you did this year. So that's the purpose of these current service estimates. CBO will produce something that is relatively similar, but uses a different methodology. And their document is what they call their baseline budget projections. Now, when you've got 2 different organizations, one that's an executive organization in OMB, and one that is a legislative organization in CBO, the natural assumption would be that their estimates and their projections would be very similar to each other. But the fact of the matter is they are not. And you will see great variation between what OMB produces and what CBO produces. The reason why is, again, because of methodology. OMB typically uses a different interest rate, a different compounding factor than CBO will use. So when you compare OMB forecasts and estimates to CBO forecasts and estimates, the natural question is, well, which organization's estimates are more accurate and less biased? And you might say, well, accuracy and bias, isn't that the same thing? It's not. They're related concepts, but they're not exactly the same thing. When we ask the question, which estimates are more accurate, we are not including a plus or minus sign. We're just looking in absolute value terms, how much different were the forecasts than what actually happened. So once that fiscal year is ended, we can go and we can see, well, what actually happened in that fiscal year, and then compare it to the estimates that were produced by OMB and CBO. The closer the estimate is to what actually happened, obviously the more accurate that projection actually was. Once you add the plus or minus sign, that's when you get into this question of bias. So for instance, do OMB estimates serially over forecast the amount of revenue that we anticipate getting? Do CBO forecasts underestimate the amount of revenue that we're getting? So that's where your plus minus directionality comes in. What we have found in terms of accuracy and bias is that both OMB and CBO are relatively accurate. They're relatively accurate in comparison to the forecasts and the estimates that are done by private sector counterparts. So there are a lot of corollary organizations in the private sector that do some of the similar things that OMB and CBO do. When you compare OMB and CBO's forecasts to the private sector, they're pretty close. And so they do a pretty good job with accuracy. The difference between OMB and CBO tends to be in the world of bias, in that you usually tend to see OMB's revenue projections being higher than what you get out of CBO. And then conversely, you tend to see the expenditure estimates from OMB being lower than the expenditure estimates from CBO. Basically what happens is OMB tends to be much rosier and much more optimistic in its projections than what we see coming out of CBO. And if you think about why, it kind of makes sense from a political perspective in that OMB works for the president. And so there's really very much of an imperative for the president to look good economically. We know there are a lot of people who vote based upon economics. There are some people who are what we call pocketbook voters, and so they will vote based upon their individual economic situation. Then you have some other voters who tend to be what we call sociotropic voters. Sociotropic voters will vote based upon their perception of the overall health of the economy for society as a whole. But either way, whether they're pocketbook or sociotropic voters, a lot of folks vote based upon the economy. So there's some very high stakes for a president to make sure that the economy looks as good as it can possibly look. And so OMB, serving the president, does what it can do to try and make that economy look a little bit better. CBO doesn't have that same imperative because instead of serving one person, CBO is serving 535 members of Congress. So it doesn't have the same imperative to try and be as optimistic as possible. So I think that's why you tend to see a little difference between OMB and CBO in terms of optimism. But OMB and CBO prepare those types of reports, and there are a lot of other corollary organizations that do similar types of things. But OMB then also in the preparation phase will put out their requests for budgets. And so it used to be called Circular A22. And Circular A22 is when the OMB would put out budget requests to all the departments and agencies across the federal government. And we'll say, give us your budget request for next year. Agencies and departments across the federal government would then provide their budget requests to OMB. OMB would be the central clearinghouse for all those requests. They would review those requests. They would almost invariably make cuts and reductions to those requests. And then all those reduced requests will then get combined together into what eventually then becomes the president's budget, the executive budget. Once all that work is done, and all these revised budget requests go into the executive budget, once the executive budget is ready to go, which is usually by the end of January, unless it's a brand new administration, brand new administrations, we tend to give them an extra couple months to get their first budget together. But if you are a second year or third year or fourth year administration, you're expected to have that executive budget done by the end of January. Typically, it coincides with the State of the Union address. And then by the very beginning of February, the president will then transmit his or her budget to Congress. Once the executive budget goes to Congress, we then shift from the preparation phase to the formulation phase. Again, that happens usually the first week in February. When the president's budget arrives in Congress, its central starting point will be with what we call the budget committees. There is one budget committee in the House of Representatives and one budget committee in the U.S. Senate. The president's budget will go to those budget committees. The job of those budget committees is to pass this thing known as a concurrent resolution on the budget. And under today's laws, that concurrent resolution on the budget must be passed by the House and the Senate budget committees no later than April 15th. And I do realize the significance of the April 15th date from a tax perspective, and I think that was not lost on those members of Congress who wrote that legislation. So the concurrent resolution on the budget must be passed by both budget committees no later than April 15th. On April 15th, whenever this concurrent resolution on the budget is passed, you'll hear a lot of media outlets saying, we have a budget. Congress agreed to a budget. That is incredibly incorrect. So don't believe them when they say that. The concurrent resolution on the budget is not a federal budget. What the concurrent resolution on the budget does is it sets maximum amounts of spending across all of your programmatic areas. So the concurrent resolution on the budget, for instance, will say, in the area of agriculture, here's the maximum amount of money that can be spent on agriculture. For health and human services, here's the maximum amount that can be spent. In education, here's the maximum amount. In veterans affairs, and so on and so on. So it sets these ceilings on the amount of money that can be spent in each one of those programmatic areas. The purpose for this concurrent resolution on the budget is obviously to try and impose some fiscal discipline on Congress throughout the formulation phase so that they have some hard caps in terms of the amount that they can appropriate in each one of those areas. So once that concurrent resolution on the budget is done by April 15th, then the focus really shifts away from the budget committees and shifts toward appropriation committees. There are two different appropriation committees. There's one appropriations committee in the House, and there is one appropriations committee in the Senate. Appropriations committees will deal with a type of spending that we call discretionary spending. And this kind of oversimplifies the budgeting process at the federal level, but essentially there are two different types of spending in the federal budget. There's discretionary spending and there's mandatory spending. Discretionary spending is spending that Congress has direct control over. So if Congress decides, here's an agriculture program, we don't think we want to fund it anymore, and they do what we call zeroing it out. When you zero out a program, you take its funding away. If it's discretionary, Congress can do that directly, and then that program goes away for a lack of funding. Not all programs are discretionary, though. Some programs fall in the category of what we call mandatory spending. So, for instance, an entitlement program is mandatory spending. Why is it mandatory spending? Because an entitlement program is based upon eligibility. So people get benefits from that entitlement program because they meet certain eligibility requirements. They have a household income level below a certain amount, and so they then become eligible for the benefits of that program. With Social Security, they have attained a certain retirement age, and they are vested in Social Security. They've met those eligibility requirements, so they are then legally eligible and entitled to the benefits from the Social Security program. Entitlement and eligibility-based programs are considered mandatory spending because Congress cannot directly reduce spending on those programs. If Congress wants to reduce spending on those programs, the only way to do it is by changing the eligibility requirements. So if you have an income eligibility-based program and you want to spend less money on that program, well, then you raise the requirement for household income level, or you lower the requirement for household income level. You can mess around with those requirements in order to either make fewer people eligible or make more people eligible. But the only way you can change funding for that program is by changing those eligibility requirements. Because once someone meets those eligibility requirements, that person then is legally entitled to the benefits that accrue from that program. So entitlement programs are mandatory spending. They do not go through the normal appropriations process. Another example of mandatory spending would be something like interest on the federal debt. As you know, one of the things Congress loves to do is Congress loves to borrow money. When Congress borrows money, and then every year when Congress spends more money than it brings in revenue, All that contributes to this ever-growing massive federal debt. But whenever you borrow money, you have to repay it with principal and interest payments. So that interest that they are paying on the debt is considered mandatory, because you borrowed the money, Congress, you're going to have to repay that money, and you're going to have to pay interest on the debt that you borrow. It's a legal requirement. Now, if Congress didn't pay that interest, and they said, well, they told the investors, go pound sand, we're not going to pay off the debt that we borrowed, well, obviously that's going to have some very negative impacts for the credit rating of the federal government. So interest on the debt, also considered to be mandatory spending, does not go through the normal appropriations process. So discretionary spending goes through appropriations. Mandatory spending goes through a process that we call authorization. So we have appropriation committees in the House and the Senate for discretionary spending. We have authorization committees in the House and the Senate for each of those programmatic areas for mandatory spending in those programmatic areas. Where we usually focus most of our attention, though, is on the discretionary spending process and on these appropriations committees, because that's really where most of the action occurs. So the House has an appropriations committee, the Senate has an appropriations committee. Each one of those appropriations committee will then have multiple, usually about a dozen subcommittees. Each one of those subcommittees will deal with a different appropriations area. Currently, and this number has changed a little bit given the year, but currently in the appropriations process, what Congress will do is it will end up passing out 12 appropriation bills for discretionary spending. So what will happen is that the subcommittee on agriculture will work on the appropriation bill in the area of agriculture. They will hold hearings, they will mark up the bill, they will then pass that bill and report it back up to the House Appropriations Committee. House Appropriations Committee will then consider that appropriations, the agriculture appropriations bill. They will hold hearings, they will mark up that bill, they will then pass the agriculture appropriations bill through the House Appropriations Committee. Once that happens, then that agriculture appropriation bill in the House will then go to the Rules Committee. In the House, before a piece of legislation goes to the floor, it must go through the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee will pass a rule that will govern how that bill is going to be debated on the floor. Usually appropriation bills are privileged pieces of legislation, so they will have some very strict limitations in terms of the amount of time that each party gets to debate and make amendments to that appropriations bill. Oftentimes, when the House Rules Committee passes a rule to allow appropriation bill to get to the floor, they will oftentimes pass a rule that prohibits amendments to that appropriation bill. So you've got that appropriations process going on in the House. Subcommittee to the House Appropriations Committee, House Appropriations Committee to the Rules Committee, Rules Committee then to the floor of the House, and then the floor of the House will then debate the bill and will then pass that bill, hopefully. In the Senate, you have a corollary situation going on where, again, the appropriation bill will start at the subcommittee level, work its way up to the Senate Appropriations Committee level. Then from that level in the Senate, there is no Rules Committee like there is in the House. Senate does have its own Rules Committee, but it's a completely different type of committee. You don't need to have a rule passed by a Rules Committee to get a piece of legislation onto the floor of the Senate. Legislation gets onto the floor of the Senate technically through what's called a UCA, or a Unanimous Consent Agreement. It is possible that one member of the Senate can stand up and object to the consideration of a piece of legislation on the Senate floor, and can, at least for a period of time, stop that legislation from making it to the floor of the Senate. We have seen a few members use their unanimous consent agreement powers, if you will, to stop legislation from getting to the floor. Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky has done it a couple times recently, but for the most part, you don't see it used a lot. There's a process that we know known as log rolling in Congress. Log rolling is where it's basically a quid pro quo, that I won't stop your legislation and then you won't stop my legislation. And that type of quid pro quo means that it's relatively easy to get a unanimous consent agreement for a piece of legislation to go to the floor, as long as the majority leader in the Senate supports that legislation. The real stoppage point for legislation in the Senate is the Senate majority leader. And the Senate majority leader is the one, if the legislation is going to get stopped, Mitch McConnell is going to be the one to stop it. But let's just play along with our little scenario here. So your agriculture appropriation bill gets through the House and gets through the Senate. Well, when it gets to the House and gets to the Senate, it's going to have two problems probably. One issue it may have is that it doesn't match the limitations that were placed upon agricultural spending way back on April 15th in this concurrent resolution on the budget. So if the agriculture appropriation bill that's passed by the House exceeds the amount that's allowed to be spent under that concurrent resolution on the budget, we're going to have to fix that. The way we fix that is through a process known as reconciliation. We'll have to reconcile the appropriation bill with the amount of money that we authorized to be spent way back on April 15th. So that's one problem. So we'll have to go through a reconciliation process. The other problem is that the version of the bill that got through the House is probably going to look a lot different than the version that got through the Senate. Constitution is very clear on this. Before a piece of legislation can go to the president for the president's approval, it must be in uniform version between the House and the Senate. It must be an identical version. In order to put it in identical version, we then have conference committees. So we'll have some members from the House Appropriations Committee and the Senate Appropriations Committee who will get together in a conference committee to hammer out the details to make this bill uniform between the House and the Senate. Once that happens, that uniform bill, once it's in identical format, once it's been reconciled, will then go back to the House and back to the Senate for final passage. Once that bill is then passed in identical format in the House and the Senate, then that appropriation bill is ready to go to the president's desk. That's going to happen 12 times for discretionary spending because we have 12 different appropriation bills. And that's how the process is designed, to have these 12 different appropriation bills go through this entire process I just discussed, and then go oftentimes individually then to the president's desk for the president's signature. That is all supposed to happen by the end of the preceding fiscal year. So that's all supposed to happen by September 30th. Because once the calendar switches over to October 1st at the federal level, we are then moving into the next fiscal year. So we're going to have budgetary authority to spend money to keep the government working. So those 12 appropriation bills are all supposed to be signed by the president by close of day, by midnight on September 30th. Then on October 1st, we then move into execution and we start spending that money. Problem with that, though, is that it rarely happens. It is very rare that all 12 appropriation bills get passed by the Congress, signed by the president, in time for the new fiscal year to begin on October 1st. That rarely occurs. So what does Congress do when that doesn't occur? Well, one thing Congress will do is once we get to October 1st, let's say that agriculture appropriation bill has not yet been passed and signed by the president. We don't have authority to spend money on any agriculture program on October 1st unless we do something. But what Congress does is it will pass what are called continuing resolutions. A continuing resolution will authorize the Department of Agriculture to spend usually 80% of what it was allowed to spend last year during a 2 or 3 week period of time. So we'll pass a continuing resolution for 2 weeks to buy ourselves some time in order to try and get this appropriation bill passed. And we will say for these 2 weeks, under this continuing resolution, Department of Agriculture, you can spend up to 80% of what you spent last year for the same 2 week period. Those 2 weeks come and go. Appropriation bill is still not agreed to. Congress then passes another continuing resolution for another 2 weeks, or maybe they'll extend it to 4 weeks to buy themselves a little bit more time. Those 2 or 4 additional weeks pass, you still don't have the appropriation bill passed and signed. well, they'll do another continuing resolution. And so you tend to have Congress doing these continuing resolutions for sometimes 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 different areas of spending for all those appropriation bills that had not yet been passed and signed by the president. Well, you can do continuing resolutions for a while, but eventually, once you get into the very late fall and the early winter, if you're still funding the government temporarily through continuing resolutions, Congress tends to do what it does best, which is panic. When Congress panics, and that will usually happen around December, beginning of the new calendar year, what Congress will do is it will take all of those appropriation bills that have not yet been passed, and they will cobble them all together into a mammoth monster piece of legislation that's called an Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, otherwise known as an OBRA, O-B-R-A, Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. That Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act, comprised of all these appropriation bills that have not yet been passed, will then be reviewed and passed by the House and the Senate, and will then go to the president for the president's signature. In short, that's no way to run a government, because what happens is when you take all these unpassed appropriation bills and you cobble them together into an OBRA, you end up throwing in a lot of extra projects, and what we'd refer to as pork barrel spending, into that OBRA, and it will be 2, 3, 4 weeks before anyone really knows all the details of what we are funding in that OBRA. That OBRA will be a massive piece of legislation, thousands and thousands of pages long. And where some of our runaway, ridiculous spending comes into play is in the creation of these OBRAs. And the only reason we create these OBRAs is because Congress and the president are unable to follow the actual process that they legally have put in place over the past 20 to 30 years. The norm today is governance through OBRAs. So it's pretty typical. We might get 3 or 4 appropriation bills passed by September 30th, and then all the rest get thrown together into this monster piece of legislation. But we need to have that authority to spend money in the new fiscal year, or else government's going to shut down. So whenever Congress comes to loggerheads with the president over the budget, so for instance, the president says, no more continuing resolutions. I'm not going to stand for any more continuing resolutions. And then Congress tries to put an OBRA together, and the president says, no, I'm not going to agree to what you've thrown into this OBRA. I'm not going to sign it. Well, you got to do something, because you don't have the money to keep government open. So what then happens is a government shutdown. So the president will then come back to Congress and say, unless you change this OBRA to my liking, then we're going to go ahead and have a government shutdown. So for all those different parts of the federal government that do not yet have authority to spend money because their appropriation bills haven't been passed, you'll have a partial government shutdown for those entities in the federal government. We have seen government shutdowns very recently, just as of a year and a half ago, we had a government shutdown where all non-essential employees will be told to stay home. Essential employees will come to work, but those essential employees typically don't get paid until after the budget has been passed, and they'll get retroactive pay. It's a real mess whenever we shut the government down, and no one really wins in a government shutdown type of situation. But I think a government shutdown, the use of OBRAs, those are all just symptoms of a very broken budgeting process at the federal level. But through an OBRA or through passing the appropriation bills, however it happens, a miracle, we have money to spend. Well, then we spend that money through the implementation period. Implementation will be that fiscal year. So at the federal level, we'll run from October 1st until September 30th. Once that fiscal year ends, we get past September 30th of the following year. We then move into the 4th phase, audit and evaluation. And audit and evaluation, again, is where we go back and we look at how we spent the money to make sure we spend it in the legally appropriate manner, and to make sure that we also hopefully spend it as efficiently and effectively as possible. In the audit and evaluation phase, you'll have federal agencies who are required to put together what are called performance activity reports. Used to be called PARTs, now they're called PARs. And those performance activity reports will be where those agencies report upon how they spent their money and how well they were able to accomplish their goals by spending that money. We have a very important organization that's oftentimes overlooked at the federal level, known as the GAO. Stands for the Government Accountability Office. Back in my day, it was the General Accounting Office. Now it's the Government Accountability Office. Government Accountability Office will produce a lot of reports and a lot of studies on just about every program at the federal level and just about every agency at the federal level as well. If you are interested in the performance of a program or the performance of a federal agency, a great place to go to is the Government Accountability Office. The Comptroller General of the United States, who is the head of the Government Accountability Office, actually has a website where you can go and you can sign up to get notices of new reports that are produced by the GAO. And they literally will create dozens upon dozens of reports every single day. So if you want to fill up your inbox or your email, you can go and sign up for that listserv. But between these 4 different phases, the federal budget for one given fiscal year will probably take at least, if not longer, than 3 years from preparation to formulation to implementation to audit and evaluation. You have a lot of overlap in that you are dealing with multiple fiscal years at the same time. So when you are dealing with the formulation for the budget for next fiscal year, you are currently in implementation for this fiscal year. And you're in audit and evaluation for the last fiscal year. And you're in preparation for 2 or 3 or 4 fiscal years into the future. And so you've got a lot of overlap between these different phases, even in one given fiscal year budget. So it becomes a very complicated, very complex type of system. We have tried multiple times over the past several years to try and reform the budget process because we have recognized that there are some major flaws. We're not getting budgets done on time. When we do get budgets done on time, if we do, then those budgets tend to spend more money than we are taking in revenue, which creates a deficit. If you're running deficits every single year for a number of years, the accumulation of those deficits will all then end up creating a larger and larger federal debt. So we recognized pretty early on that we needed to keep tweaking the process and trying to make the process better. One very early attempt to make the process better was the creation of this organization called the Bureau of the Budget way back in 1921. Well, why am I mentioning a reform back in 1921? Because the Bureau of the Budget is what would eventually become known as the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, that we've made reference to many times already in this video. So the Office of Management and Budget has its antecedents all the way back to 1921. In 1937, was placed within the Executive Office of the President to recognize its management role for the federal bureaucracy. And then finally in 1970 was renamed the Office of Management and Budget, again adding that management term in the title to recognize the increased scope of the power and responsibilities of the Office of Management and Budget. So basically what we have done over decades is we have created this very powerful organization, the OMB, to serve the President of the United States. Well, Congress felt very left out because they said the President has his own organization. We don't have a corollary organization. We don't have the same type of organization to do those types of tasks to provide us with the information that OMB provides to the President. So in 1974, Congress decided we need to fundamentally overhaul the federal budgeting process. And so Congress passed this thing called the Budget and Impoundment Control Act. The Budget and Impoundment Control Act had several different goals. The first goal, as I said before, was to make Congress a co-equal in the budgeting process, to give some resources and power to Congress to try and counter what had become a very executive-driven budgeting process. Second goal was to give some rhyme and reason for when the federal budget, when the President's budget comes to Congress. Where does it go? Who gets first crack at this federal budget? Problem in the past was that when the President's budget came to Congress, it bounced all over the place. Everybody was in the kitchen, everybody had their fingers in it, And it really was a decentralized process. They want to centralize the formulation phase within Congress. They want to try and do something about these deficits, trying to eliminate the deficits or at least make the deficits smaller and try and get the federal budget done on time. So they had several goals with this Budget and Impoundment Control Act. So the way they went about trying to accomplish these goals, number one, they created budget committees in the House and the Senate. Those House and Senate budget committees are still with us today. That's where the federal budget would start. It empowered these budget committees with creating, for eventual passage, budget resolution. So the whole idea of a budget resolution, this concurrent resolution on the budget I talked about earlier, the whole idea for that budget resolution process came out of this act in 1974. But in the original act, what it required is the creation of two different budget resolutions. A first budget resolution that would be non-binding, and that would have to be passed by May, and then a second budget resolution that would be binding, that would be passed in middle of September. So it creates this idea of a resolution. It created the Congressional Budget Office to serve as a counterbalance to the Office of Management and Budget. President, you have the OMB, we are going to have the Congressional Budget Office to give us information and produce studies for us. It changed the fiscal year, so the fiscal year would begin on October 1st and end on September 30th. It attempted to try and control something called backdoor spending. Backdoor spending is discretionary spending that happens outside of the appropriations process. Now, in theory, if it's discretionary spending, it should happen within appropriations. There should be an appropriation bill that governs that type of discretionary spending. But Congress found a whole lot of neat little ways in which it could circumvent the appropriations process and still spend money on discretionary programs. Things like emergency appropriations. So, this emergency came up, and it happened to come up after the election in November. We don't want to deal with this contentious issue in the appropriation process back in August and September because we're running for re-election in November. So we're just going to, spend as little money as we can until we get to after November. Then once the election's over, oh my gosh, there's an emergency. We need to do this emergency appropriation. Well, that's outside of the normal appropriations process. Congress has a lot of neat little tricks like that. One of my favorite tricks is what's called an 11-month appropriation. Now, to us, most calendar years tend to have 12 months in them. For Congress, sometimes they only recognize 11 of those 12 months. So in order to try and save money, what they will do is they will pass an 11-month appropriation. And then once those 11 months are up, then they'll go back and do an emergency appropriation to cover that final 12th month. Why? Because you're spending less money and it makes your federal budget look better as you stand for re-election in November. So a lot of these things obviously have some very strong political motivations. But they want to try and control some of that to, again, try and get some rein in the federal budget process. And then finally, they wanted to try and control the president in this process known as presidential impoundments. Richard Nixon was very well known for impounding money. But what does impounding money mean? It means that presidents do not have a line item veto. So whenever an appropriation bill comes across the president's desk, the president must either sign that bill, veto that bill, but they can't pick and choose things in the bill to approve and things not to approve. So if an appropriation bill comes across the desk of a president, the president looks at that bill and says, well, I agree with the majority of this appropriation bill, but there are a handful of programs in here I don't agree with. So what the president will do is will sign that appropriations bill and then will impound or withhold the spending of money on those programs that the president does not agree with. There are two different types of impoundments. There's what are called deferrals and rescissions. A deferral is where the president will say, I'm not going to spend the money on this program now, but I will in the future. So I'm just going to delay the spending on this program. So maybe I'm going to just delay it until federal income tax revenues come in. So try and sync it up with our revenue stream. That's a deferral. That's not that big of a deal because eventually the money will be released and spent. It's more of an administrative type of impoundment. Rescissions, that's the type of impoundment that really, really made Congress angry. Because with a rescission, the president says, I will not spend this money because I do not agree with this program. Well, that's Congress changing the intent, and actually not just the intent, but the actual language of that appropriations bill by saying, I'm not going to fund this program, I'm not going to spend this money. So Congress really wanted to rein in that activity and try and get some brakes put on presidents in terms of using their impoundment power. So the Budget Impoundment Control Act, some of the things it did, some of its reforms worked, and they're still around today. Some of the reforms didn't work and actually were found to be unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Obviously, budget committees are still around, and they're still operating kind of the same way in which they did in the 1970s. So I guess you could call the House and Senate Budget Committee creation a success. The resolutions that these committees were charged with passing, though, they actually did fail. And the reason why they failed is, remember, you had a two-part resolution process. You had a non-binding resolution in May and then a binding resolution in September. But the non-binding resolution in May had no legal authority. So it's just Congress saying, well, we kind of want to stay around this spending number for this program or for this spending area. But it wasn't binding. So all you really did is you tipped off interest groups. When they would see this first budget resolution, they would say, Congress is cutting our program. Let's descend upon Congress and let's lobby Congress to get that money restored. So having that first resolution in May be non-binding basically politicized the process. And it just opened the doors of Congress and invited all these interest groups, invited all these lobbyists to come in and participate in the budgeting process. That second resolution that was binding, that came about in September, the problem with that one is it just came too late in the process. Once you get to the middle of September, you have 2 weeks left, and you just don't have time to reconcile the amount of money that you're planning on spending with the amount that's authorized under that binding second budget resolution. So we got rid of the two-part process. Now we have this one concurrent resolution on the budget that occurs on April 15th. So the idea of a resolution is still around. It's just we modified it to make it one concurrent budget resolution. The impoundment control attempts by Congress in the Budget Impoundment Control Act were unsuccessful. They were unsuccessful primarily because they were unconstitutional. The way in which Congress wrote the law is if a president was going to do a rescission and refuse to spend that money, impound that money, then that money that was being impounded by the president could be released by a vote of either the House or the Senate. So you have Congress saying just one body of Congress is sufficient to override an action taken by the president. Well, the Constitution is pretty clear on that. If the president vetoes something, it's got to be overridden by a 2/3 vote of both the House as well as the Senate. A one-house veto was declared to be unconstitutional. So the impoundment controls didn't work at all because they violated the Constitution. And it's not unusual for Congress every now and then to pass a law that is not in accordance with constitutional principles. Well, how well do they do in terms of trying to control this backdoor spending, the spending going on outside the appropriations process? Not real well, because they exempted about 75 to 80% of the budget from those backdoor spending limitations. So it was more rhetorical than it was in reality. Despite all these failures, the general framework for the budgeting process that was given to us by the Budget Impoundment Control Act, that general process is still more or less in place today. We fast forward into the 1980s. So we're working under this process that was given to us by the Budget Impoundment Control Act. We get to the mid-1980s, we get to 1985. The federal government, by 1985, had run 16 consecutive years of a federal budget deficit. And every one of those years, it seemed the federal budget deficit was becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. So much so that in 1985, there was a lot of panic about the size of the federal budget deficit. Now, it's kind of Pollyannish now. We kind of look back at it in 2020 figures and we laugh at, how concerned they were about their runaway budget deficit in 1985 compared to what the budget deficit looks like today. There's a lot of alarm bells going off about budget deficits. So we get a series of two different pieces of legislation, and they usually go by the common names Gramm-Rudman-Hollings, named after the three members of the Senate who co-authored the legislation, Phil Gramm, Warren Rudman, and Fritz Hollings. Phil Gramm, a Republican from Texas, Warren Rudman, a Republican turned independent, and Fritz Hollings, a Democrat from South Carolina. So it's a bipartisan piece of legislation, and the goal of Gramm-Rudman-Hollings in 1985 was to control deficits by giving us deficit targets. So we created a timetable. We said for each year, here is the maximum deficit that will be allowed. If in any of those years, the amount of the deficit is larger than the target in the timetable, it would then trigger this process known as sequestration. It's your 25-cent word of the day, sequestration. Sequestration was a process by which for every dollar that our deficit was exceeding our deficit target, we would have to have dollar-to-dollar reductions. So we would have to make across-the-board reductions to all non-exempt programs until we could bring the size of the deficit for that year down to at least match the target that was in the deficit reduction timetable. The idea with sequestration is it was supposed to be such a politically repugnant process that no one would ever want to engage in, because across-the-board cuts can be very, very painful. And there are some very popular programs, electorally popular programs, that a member of Congress is going to have to cut in order to sequester those funds to get down to the deficit target. So the hope was no one would want to go into the world of sequestration. Well, that wasn't true. Congress continued to exceed their deficit targets. We would go into sequestration. The way in which sequestration would work is that the president would recommend areas of funds to sequester. So the president would recommend, here are the areas that we should cut in these non-exempt programs. And then the Comptroller General of the United States, the head of what was then the General Accounting Office, would monitor and approve those cuts that were being offered by the president. Well, that's a problem, and that's a constitutional problem. Because separation of powers tells us that we have three co-equal branches of government. And basically what Congress did is they took the Comptroller General, who is technically an employee of Congress, and they placed a congressional employee in charge of reviewing the actions of a president. A clear violation of separation of powers, and so that aspect of Gramm-Rudman-Hollings was declared unconstitutional. So 2 years later, they went back to the drawing board. They rewrote the legislation into what became known as Gramm-Rudman-Hollings II, the sequel. And we all know that typically sequels are not better than the original, and this is no exception to that. Gramm-Rudman-Hollings II, they changed the timetable. They just increased the deficit targets and said, let's start over again, and let's try this again. Same thing happened that happened 2 years earlier. We continued to exceed the deficit targets. Because what Congress could do is Congress could just change those targets. There was nothing to stop them from saying, okay, we're coming in, $500 million over our target. Let's just raise the target by $500 million and start again next year. And they do that year after year after year. So basically what we found is that you had a constitutional problem with Gramm-Rudman-Hollings in terms of sequestration, and you did not have the political willpower in Congress to adhere to those deficit targets. So Gramm-Rudman-Hollings 1 and 2 both failed to eliminate deficits. And in fact, deficits continued to grow during the implementation of both of those acts. So we get to 1990. We're going to try it again. And we're going to try it in 1990 with this thing called the Budget Enforcement Act. Budget Enforcement Act of 1990 tried to change the language a little bit. So in Gramm-Rudman-Hollings, we were focusing on deficits. In the Budget Enforcement Act, the logic changed. And the logic became, instead of focusing directly on deficits, let's focus on the root cause of a deficit. And the root cause of the deficit is runaway federal spending. So let's focus on spending, and if we can lower that spending, then in turn, we'll probably be able to lower those deficits. So the goal was to lower and eliminate deficits by reducing spending. So how'd they do it? Well, they decided we needed some fiscal discipline in how we spent money at the federal level. So Congress set up 3 different categories of spending: domestic spending, international spending, and defense spending. 3 separate categories. And then they put what we call firewalls between each category. And the firewall meant that you can't cross over from one category to another. So if you want to increase spending on domestic programs, you cannot rob from international spending in order to pay for an increase in domestic spending, and vice versa. If you want to increase spending on domestic programs, you must pay for it by cutting another domestic program within that same category. You couldn't cross over your firewalls. And it introduced this concept known as PAYGO. And PAYGO is back in the news now because some members of the Senate want to use PAYGO again. A lot of members of the House don't want to use PAYGO. But PAYGO stands for pay as you go. So if you are going to increase spending on one federal program, you have to pay for it by decreasing spending on another federal program within that same broad category. So within domestic or within international or within defense. Not exactly a radical idea that if you're going to spend more money, you're going to have to cut money someplace else. But for Congress, that was a radical idea because to spend more money, they would just borrow money. If we want to spend money on this program, we'll just borrow it. Well, now you've got to find a way to pay for it by making other cuts in other programs within that same category. Pay as you go or PAYGO. Now, the Budget Enforcement Act had some element of success in that we still see those 3 general categories of spending. We're still talking about PAYGO and the usefulness of PAYGO in our current budget cycle. But I think what happened is the Budget Enforcement Act, by focusing on spending cuts, really reoriented our way of understanding federal budgets and how we can eliminate deficits. You combine that Budget Enforcement Act with the Balanced Budget Acts of the 1993 and Balanced Budget Act in 1997, and essentially what ended up happening is by the time you got to fiscal year 1998, 1999, we had, at least on paper, eliminated budget deficits. We had gone from deficit spending at the federal level to surplus spending. Now, a lot of that can also be attributed to a very quickly growing economy. Think about the 1990s, you had the dot-com boom. And the dot-com boom was then increasing economic growth rates to levels we hadn't seen for many years. So instead of what we would anticipate to be a 1.5% or 2% quarterly increase in economic growth rates, we were seeing increases upwards of 7, 8, and 9%. Whenever the economy grows that quickly, you've got a lot of extra revenue coming into federal government coffers. If you can combine this additional revenue with fiscal discipline to reduce the amount of spending that you were doing, more revenue, less spending, it's not calculus, it's pretty easy to figure out that you're going to probably be able to reduce your deficits and maybe even eliminate them. Now, obviously in 2001, with the events of September 11th, we saw great increase in the amount of spending, a reduction in the amount of revenue, and we were back into deficit spending again by 2001, and we have continued in deficit spending even up until today. And over the past few years, we've seen that deficit continue to increase every year and get bigger and bigger and bigger. So the current process at the federal level is basically what we've explained here, in that you've got your 4 different phases: preparation, formulation, implementation, and audit and evaluation. The process at the federal level is considered to be an executive-driven process because the process starts with the creation of the executive budget by the president. Congress then must work within the parameters established within that presidential budget. And then the final approval of those appropriation bills obviously reside at the president's desk. So the federal system tends to be a relatively executive-dominated system. You have a couple of videos that you can take a look at to kind of reinforce just how executive-driven the federal process is. At the state level, whether or not it's an executive or legislative dominated process will depend upon the state government. We have some states that have a very executive-dominated process. We have some states that have a much more legislatively dominated process. Wisconsin typically is an example of a truly executive-dominated process. California is not far behind in that we are also very executive-heavy in terms of the way in which our process works. Now, some of the differences in the California process as compared to the federal process, the beginning of the time frame is relatively similar in that the governor will put together his or her budget bill and will do that in January and then transmit that to the state legislature. State legislature also has a committee structure somewhat similar to the federal level, but a lot of those committees go by different terms than what you see in Congress. But legislature will work through their initial committee hearings on the governor's budget throughout February and March and April. But a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of the real important decisions probably are not going to happen until May here in California. Because here in California, we have this interesting thing called a May revise. So the budget that the governor prepared back in January was based upon certain assumptions in terms of the amount of revenue that would be generated from state sales taxes, state income taxes, and all these other revenue sources. Between January and May, things can change. And there's no better example of things changing than 2020. When the when the governor put that budget together in January, that was pre-pandemic. Once we get to May, we really start to see the impacts of the pandemic on the ability to generate revenue. And so in May revise, what happens is the governor will then present a revision to the assumptions of the budget in January. So when the May revise came out from the governor this past May, there were some drastic draconian reductions in revenue assumptions and then obviously budget allocations. So it was a slash and burn type of budget revision in May of this year. Once that May revise comes out, then the state legislature can really get to work in earnest on passing the state budget. Because up until the May revise, nobody really knows what the final number will be in terms of the amount of revenue being generated. If you don't know the amount of revenue being generated, it's going to be very difficult for you to actually make appropriations. So once that May revise came out, then the state legislature really got to work in earnest. And what happened in June is we saw the state legislature go into a different direction than the governor. In the governor's May revise, he did not base his budget on receiving federal stimulus money. And I know we've got a big conversation going on in Congress now about a second stimulus package and how much money Congress is going to give to state and local governments to help deal with the impacts of the pandemic. Well, Governor Newsom did not incorporate any expectations of federal government money coming in. And so there are some huge reductions across the board to a lot of areas. Education got hit very, very hard in the May revise. The state legislature in June took a different tact in that the state legislature, rather than mandating these huge reductions in budgeting, what they did is they are assuming that the state will get some federal money and will get a good bit, billions of dollars in federal money coming in the very near future. So the budget that was passed by the state legislature in June, by June 15th, looked a lot different than the budget in the May revise that was provided to them by the governor. So you had the state legislature saying, we are going to not make the huge cuts, anticipating we're going to get federal money. The governor saying, we need to go ahead and make the cuts because we may not get the federal money. Well, you then had your negotiation in late June between the governor and the state legislature. And by the end of June, before the beginning of the new fiscal year on July 1st here in California, they came to an agreement. And the agreement was essentially that the governor then signed off on the state legislature's approach. So what's happening now for a lot of local governments is that in the California state budget, they are going to have to deal with what are called deferrals, where the state will say, we are going to defer payments to you as a local government for a series of months waiting for hopefully that federal money to come in. That puts local governments in a bind because when they are not receiving their money from the state government, they still have to make payroll. And so what you're going to see this year, this budget year, you're going to see a lot of local government dipping into their reserves. And if they don't have reserves to dip into, they're going to be going out there and borrowing money. And they're going to be borrowing money through something that's called a tax and revenue anticipation note. And we'll get into a discussion of revenue anticipation notes when we get into debt and debt financing. But just for our purposes now, I think you're going to see a lot of local governments borrowing a lot of money to make their payroll, waiting for these deferrals to then finally come in from the state government. The open question with the budget, and it's a very difficult question for a lot of local governments, is what happens if this federal stimulus money never materializes? Will these deferrals then become outright budget cuts? And I don't really see much of a path other than that happening, that the federal budget money does not come in. I think these deferrals will be permanent cuts to local governments, which really could end up being devastating for a lot of especially special purpose governments. When the state legislature passes the budget and comes to an agreement with the governor and the governor signs that budget, the process is not done here in California. Here in California, we have this thing known as a trailer bill process. So once the state budget is agreed to, you need to have enabling legislation that provides the language to tell us how to implement those budget appropriations. Well, all that language on how you actually do it and the specifics, that's all found in what we call trailer bills. So throughout July and into August, you'll see, and really sometimes into September, you'll see the state legislature passing trailer bills that will then provide us with the specifics for how the budget should then be implemented. So when you look at the state budget in California, you got to take those trailer bills into account as well, because they can really have a major impact in terms of how restrictive some of the spending is in the state budget, because they will give you as a local government some idea in terms of you may spend the money on this, you may not spend the money on this. You may get the money and you'll get your appropriation if this happens, you won't get your appropriation if that happens. So the trailer bill is really important and kind of a unique aspect in comparison between the California process and the federal process. If you want an example of a legislatively dominated budget process, look at the state of Texas. The state of Texas, their process is very much dominated by the state legislature. There's what's called a legislative budget board made up of leaders of the state legislature. The governor does not have independent authority to put the state budget together to transmit to the legislature. The governor must put the budget together in consultation with this legislative budget board. So what makes it such a legislatively dominated process is that the state legislature is involved in putting the executive budget together. They are involved in the preparation phase. Here in California, most of the work in preparation belongs to the executive branch. Now here in California, we do have an important organization called the LAO. So if you're going to look at a corollary situation to the federal level, the president has OMB and Congress has CBO. Here in California, the governor has the Department of Finance and the state legislature has the Legislative Analyst Office, or the LAO. And that's kind of a corollary for how the state budget process works compared to the federal level. So the Legislative Analyst Office will come in and give us estimates in terms of revenue forecasts, expenditure estimates. They're very helpful in telling us for a referendum or for an initiative how much that referendum or that initiative will cost for the state budget. And they will put financial projections, if you will, and attach those to all referenda and all initiatives that are on the California budget. And here in California, we have those elements of a direct democracy, whereby we have a referendum process and we have an initiative process. We do a lot of decision-making at the ballot box. We allow voters to make a lot of those decisions. But when voters make those decisions, they're going to have fiscal implications. and they will have implications on the budget and how much money the state government needs to spend. A great example there in the world of education is Prop 98. Proposition 98 requires that the state government spend 40% of general fund revenue on education. Again, that kind of puts the state government in a box in terms of it must then meet its Prop 98 guarantee, which means that it can't spend money in other programmatic areas. But Wisconsin and California, very executive dominated, look and feel a lot like the federal process with some changes and differences. Texas, very legislatively dominated, where the governor does not have the ability to independently create the state budget. But again, it all depends upon the state. It depends upon the prevailing political culture in that state. One of the reasons why Texas is so legislatively dominated is that historically in Texas, interest groups have a lot of power, and they're very involved in legislation. So it's not surprising that when you have interest groups that are more involved in the legislation process, you would have more of a role for the legislature to play in putting together that budget that, after all, is a statement of the priorities for the state of Texas. When you get down to the local level, and we know we have tens of thousands, we have over 70,000 local governments in this country. The way in which a local government will do its budgeting will oftentimes depend, number one, on state law, number two, on the type of government it is, and then number three, the type of governance structure that we see in that local government. So state law will oftentimes dictate how a local government will put its budget together. If a local government is a charter government, so local government has home rule in that they are incorporated, they are a charter government. Charter governments, home rule governments here in California, which are primarily general purpose governments of a certain size and population density, those charter governments have a lot more flexibility in how they create their budgets. If you are not a charter government, you don't have that home rule capability, then there's a very good chance that you will then have to follow state law, and state law will prescribe how your budgets are created and all the ins and outs of your budget process. If you're a general purpose government, you're probably going to have a lot more flexibility and a lot more power in terms of putting your budget together. If you're a special purpose government, you will be much more limited. So I'll give you an example. A school district here in California. When a school district in California puts together its budget, it is responsible then to the County Office of Education and must submit its budget to the County Office of Education to have that approved by the County Office of Education. It is then also subject to any of the dictates that come from the Board of Supervisors in the county in which that school district is located. It is then subject as well to the State Department of Education. It is subject to the state legislature. It has a whole lot of oversight, and more oversight than what you would typically see, for instance, with the city. You know, a city doesn't have to have its budget approved by the county. A school district does have to have its budget approved by the county. But then number three, another influence is the governance structure in that local government. So is that a strong mayor type of government? Is it a weak mayor form of government? Is it a commission form of government? Is it a reform government that has a city manager? All those considerations will have an impact upon how the budget is constructed in that local government. A strong mayor form of government, and you're familiar with the difference between a strong mayor and a weak mayor form of government. We're not referring to the individual in the office. We're talking about the office itself. In a strong mayor form of government, the mayor is independently elected. So you have a mayoral election. When you have a mayor who is independently elected, that individual will have their own repository of power. They will have their own base of power that they can operate from. In a weak mayor form of government, the mayor is not independently elected, and the mayor comes from city council. So you have a city council election, and then one member of city council that year will then serve as mayor. And usually it's done on a rotational basis. Then the next year, someone else becomes mayor, and so on and so on. So typically you'll have, in 1 year, one person becomes mayor, another person is then mayor pro tem. Then the next year, the mayor pro tem becomes mayor and somebody else becomes mayor pro tem, and so on and so on. There can be some alterations there. There can be some times where you don't follow the normal rotation, But for the most part, in a weak mayor form of government, you have the mayor coming directly from city council. So in that type of government, the mayor would not have a whole lot of control over the budget, the creation of the budget. Most of that's going to reside with city council or with the city manager if you have a city manager form of government. So it really depends upon the governance structure, who is in charge of putting the budget together and who has control over those priorities in the executive budget. So a lot of variation, even in California. So a lot of variation in terms of how budgets are constructed at the local level. When you look at a budget document in the local government, you oftentimes see the budget will come from the city manager's office. And so the city manager will have a letter of transmittal where they transmit that budget to the mayor and the city council. And a lot of it will start within the city manager's office. Sometimes it'll start with the treasurer, but oftentimes it's a city manager if it's a reform type of government. So yeah, the moral of the story is, I know we've covered a lot of ground here between federal, state, and local government processes, is that you have some similarities. And state and local governments tend to piggyback off a lot of the processes that are used at the federal level, but you do have some distinct differences in terms of fiscal years, in terms of the types of committees in the legislature, in terms of the power of the chief executive. So there still is a whole lot of variation. That variation is really what we get from our system of federalism. So based upon that discussion, you've got some videos available for you this week to take a look at, a government budgeting cycle video. Again, just kind of reiterate what we talked about with the 4 different phases of the budget process. Video specifically on the federal budget process. We've got one specifically on the California state budget process, and then a website that will introduce you to the different elements in the state budget here in California for 2020. Assignments for this week, you have a multimedia discussion board assignment. And that multimedia discussion board assignment, I want you to look at the California state budget. I want you to take a look at the governor's proposed budget from back in January. Then take a look at the May revise and the changes that he made to that budget in May. And then look at the enacted budget, the budget that was actually agreed to by the state legislature and the governor. After review all 3 of those documents, the proposed budget from January, the May revise, and the enacted budget, think about these and answer these questions. What are 2 priorities in the governor's budget back in January? How have those priorities changed as a result of the May revise? And then how do those priorities change again as a result of the budget agreement between the governor and the state legislature? So if you look at those 3 documents and then answering those 3 questions. Then this week you also have a journal assignment. For this journal assignment, you'll search the internet, find a copy of the latest federal budget. Try to locate a summary that shows major categories of department level budgets to get an idea of how tax dollars are being spent. Reflect on programs and expenses at the federal level, and we oftentimes call them expenditures at the federal level because of the type of accounting system we use, but we'll get into that in a future week. Remember when we say the federal government should fund X, we're really saying that we want the federal government to take money from through taxes away from another program to give to program or project X. Are you willing to pay the federal government through taxes and fees for them to maintain federal parks, the Health and Human Services Department, federal programs? Generally, how much of your check do you want the government to take to fund the programs that you find meaningful and that you believe in? So given all this and using this information, just develop 1 paragraph. So this is a very brief journal entry, but 1 paragraph on what priorities you would like to see emphasized in the next federal budget. Again, if you look at the calendar and see where we're at now, we're currently in the implementation phase for this fiscal year. The new budget for the new fiscal year technically should be done by September 30th. It's not going to be, I guarantee you that, but it technically should be done by September 30th. So think about that budget for the next fiscal year. What would you like to see emphasized in that next budget? What would you like to see reduced? So what programs would you like to see more funding for? What programs would you like to see less funding for? And you can be general here because, again, it's just 1 paragraph So you don't have a whole lot of time to get really specific. So, general programs or general policy areas are certainly fine. Remember to include thoughts from Morton Grodson's explanation of dual and cooperative federalism when deciding which level of government is most appropriate for the variety of expenditures. I think one of the goals of the program at this point is to have you refer back in all of your classes to some of those classical articles you read in your foundations class, and to give you an opportunity to afford you a chance to incorporate these classic public administration theories and theorists into each different topic area in each different class in the program. So we know what Grodson tells us about his thoughts on dual versus cooperative federalism. His belief that dual federalism probably never existed. We've always had a cooperative approach to federalism. But think about his arguments that he makes in that article when deciding which level of government is most appropriate for the expenditures. Explain how these priorities can be emphasized while still remaining fiscally responsible. So again, think about, because if you're saying that you think that these programs in the federal budget should be expanded, then you're arguing for more federal intervention, if you will, in the economy and the affairs of state governments. That would be more of an overlapping cooperative type of approach. If you're saying, well, there should be less spending by the federal government because that's something that belongs to the states, that's going to be more of a dual federalism type of orientation. So just root your paragraph and your argument in that idea from Grodson's of dual versus cooperative federalism. And I do realize that there are a lot more nuances when you talk about federalism and different models of federalism, the competitive federalism and creative federalism. But here we're just kind of looking at that duality of dual federalism versus cooperative federalism. So I think that's it. That's everything for this week. I know it was kind of a long video, but it's still yeoman's work to try and take this entire federal budget process and try and encapsulate it down into 40 or 45-minute video. Not an easy thing to do because, again, there are entire courses that are offered on the federal budget process that still just to get the very tip of the iceberg. But I hope some of this information provided a good context for you. As always, if you have any questions at all or any concerns, feel free to email me. Otherwise, I hope you enjoy the information. I hope everyone has a really great week. So take care.